That evening, if the security team had been 5 minutes slower, and if I had taken just one more bite of the dish my son personally ordered for me, I would not be telling this story today, and the empire I spent 4 decades building would already belong to the very people who believed. I was too old to see betrayal coming. My name is Charles Bennett. I am 62 years old, and I built Bennett Hospitality Group from a failing neighborhood diner into a respected network of 10 upscale restaurants across Illinois and southern Wisconsin, establishments where governors, investors, and celebrities request private rooms under assumed names. Yet for all my experience in reading contracts and competitors, I nearly failed to read my own son. Across a dinner table, that evening was supposed to be a reconciliation, a celebration arranged by my only child, Ethan Bennett, who claimed he wanted to discuss unity, succession, and the future of the company that carried our name, and I allowed myself to believe that perhaps time had softened the resentment I had seen building inside him for years. Ethan was 32 years old, academically undisciplined yet socially perceptive, a man who understood how to influence conversations, even if he never fully understood the weight of responsibility behind the outcomes he pursued. And while I had always known he desired control of the business, I underestimated how far impatience could push a man who felt entitled to power. We were seated at our flagship restaurant overlooking the Chicago River, a property I renovated personally 15 years earlier, and as city lights shimmered against the glass walls, Ethan spoke calmly about expansion strategies and generational transition, using phrases that sounded prepared, rather than spontaneous, as though he had rehearsed them in front of a mirror. He casually mentioned Gregory Shaw, our most aggressive competitor in the Midwest fine dining market, presenting the name as industry gossip rather than threat. Yet the timing of that mention lingered in my thoughts longer than it should have. Gregory Shaw had attempted repeatedly to acquire one of my prime locations, and each time I had declined without hesitation. As my son described partnership models and fresh leadership approaches, I found myself thinking of my late wife, Margaret Bennett, whose steady judgment once balanced my strictness and softened Ethan's insecurities, before illness left our home quieter and our relationship more strained. When the first course arrived, Ethan insisted that I try a specially curated tasting plate he had selected himself, assuring me that tonight required something exceptional rather than routine. And although I normally avoided rich seafood combinations, I agreed, choosing trust over suspicion. Moments later, his phone vibrated, and he excused himself with unusual urgency, claiming that an investor needed immediate confirmation regarding a new expansion concept. And as he walked toward the entrance, I noticed a steadiness in his posture that felt less like distraction and more like certainty. I lifted my fork and tasted the dish he had chosen, detecting a richness, layered with a faint bitterness, that lingered at the back of my throat, longer than any spice should. And within seconds, a subtle warmth began spreading through my chest, heavy and unfamiliar. Before I could analyze the sensation further, a presence approached from behind, composed and deliberate, and I turned to see Thomas Calloway, the building's head of security, a man I recognized from previous visits due to his disciplined posture and watchful eyes. Thomas leaned closer than formal protocol allowed and whispered that I should not take another bite of the food in front of me, informing me that my son had been seen in the parking structure minutes earlier, meeting with 2 men known locally for intimidation work tied to Gregory Shaw's operations, which is my business competitor. He explained that those men had entered the building separately after Ethan, positioning themselves near service corridors rather than dining areas, and that surveillance footage suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The warmth in my chest sharpened into something colder and more deliberate, as Thomas advised me to follow him discreetly to a private office so we could review what his team had observed. I glanced toward the glass doors where my son had disappeared into the Chicago night, and for the first time in my life I felt something fracture that had nothing to do with market competition or declining margins. If Ethan had aligned himself with Gregory Shaw, if those men downstairs were not chance acquaintances but hired presence, then this dinner was never about reconciliation. It was about transition, and I had just tasted the opening move as I rose from the table without drawing attention, leaving behind the half-finished plate and the untouched wine. I felt the first true wave of clarity cut through the warmth spreading in my chest. and for the first time in decades I made a decision not as a father or as a host, but as a strategist who understood that survival sometimes requires silence before confrontation. Thomas Calloway guided me through a discreet hallway behind the dining area, past the kitchen entrance and into a secured office that monitored not only the restaurant floor but also the parking structure and private entrances, and once the door closed behind us, the ambient noise of the dining room disappeared, replaced by the hum of surveillance equipment and the steady pulse of controlled tension. He did not waste time with speculation or dramatic explanations, instead pulling up footage from less than 40 minutes earlier. And there on the screen I saw my son standing near the concrete pillars of the lower parking level speaking with two men whose posture and movements suggested familiarity with intimidation rather than hospitality. One of the men handed Ethan something small and metallic before gesturing toward the service entrance. And although the object was too distant to identify clearly, the exchange carried the unmistakable rhythm of coordination rather than coincidence, and my pulse steadied in a way that surprised even me. Thomas informed me that those same two men had entered the building separately and positioned themselves near staff corridors rather than dining tables, and that one of them had briefly interacted with a kitchen runner before leaving through a rear exit 10 minutes later, which aligned precisely with the timing of the dish being delivered to my table. I felt the warmth in my chest intensify, not violently but steadily, and Thomas immediately called for a private medical service we kept on retainer for high-profile guests, explaining that he had already requested a sample of the remaining food from my table be secured for testing as a precaution. Even in that moment, what disturbed me more than the physical sensation was the precision of the setup, because poisoning in a public restaurant risked exposure unless those involved believed the circumstances would be dismissed as natural health failure, especially considering my age and the stress associated with running a multi-location enterprise. Thomas hesitated briefly before adding that one of his team members overheard fragments of conversation between Ethan and the two men in the parking structure. And though audio was incomplete, the words transfer, timing, and after tonight were captured clearly enough to remove any illusion of misunderstanding. My son had not come to celebrate. He had come to accelerate. I asked Thomas whether Gregory Shaw had been seen near the premises, and although Shaw himself did not appear on footage, one of the men from the parking structure had previously been associated with Shaw's downtown steakhouse security detail during a labor dispute incident 2 years earlier, which confirmed that this was not a random criminal approach but an extension of corporate hostility. The private physician arrived within 15 minutes and conducted a rapid evaluation, drawing blood and administering medication designed to counter potential toxins while maintaining discretion. And although symptoms remained controlled, the doctor advised immediate hospital observation under a confidential admission process. I declined the hospital for that evening, not out of denial, but because disappearance would signal panic, and panic would alert those responsible that their attempt had been detected, which would push them into faster action before I had time to understand the full scope of their plan. Instead, I requested that Thomas discreetly escort me through a separate exit and arrange for transport to my downtown residence where I could monitor my condition under private medical supervision while reviewing company access logs and financial authorizations. On the drive home, as the Chicago skyline reflected across the windshield, I replayed Ethan's composure. At dinner, the unnatural calm in his posture, the rehearsed language about transition, and the mention of Gregory Shaw inserted casually into conversation, and I understood that this had not been spontaneous desperation, but structured strategy. Ethan knew that majority control of Bennett Hospitality Group would not automatically transfer to him without my authorization, and he knew that my will stipulated conditional succession based on performance benchmarks and board approval, which meant that my sudden death would trigger a temporary freeze in leadership, while legal review determined interim control. That freeze would create vulnerability, and vulnerability would allow Gregory Shaw to propose acquisition under the guise of stabilizing the brand during uncertainty. When I arrived at my residence overlooking Lake Michigan, I felt the medication stabilizing my pulse while anger began replacing shock. And that anger was not explosive or loud but cold and deliberate, the kind that builds slowly behind still eyes. Inside my study, I accessed internal server logs and immediately noticed that Ethan had requested access to several high-level operational reports earlier that week, including vendor contracts and property lease agreements that were normally restricted to executive leadership. And although I had approved limited access out of paternal optimism, I now saw how that optimism had been exploited. Margaret's portrait hung on the wall beside my desk, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what she would have said had she been alive to witness this fracture. Yet sentimentality could not override strategy, and I understood that confronting Ethan immediately would only force him deeper into Gregory Shaw's influence. If my son believed I was unaware, then he would proceed with confidence. If Gregory Shaw believed his plan was advancing undetected, he would expose more of his network, and if those men in the parking structure believed the job was incomplete, they might attempt something less subtle next time. That realization solidified my next move, not as a father seeking answers, but as a founder protecting an empire, and as a man refusing to become collateral damage in his own succession. I contacted Thomas Calloway again, and instructed him to maintain discreet surveillance on any individual connected to Shaw's operations who entered any of my 10 restaurants, while simultaneously initiating an internal audit under the guise of quarterly compliance review, so that no suspicion would point toward immediate retaliation. Then I made a decision that felt heavier than any contract I had ever signed. I would not remove Ethan from the company immediately. I would promote him publicly, because nothing exposes ambition faster than proximity to power. And if my son believed he had positioned himself one step away from control, I intended to let him step closer. Because proximity does not only reveal ambition, it reveals weakness. And weakness under pressure exposes alliances that secrecy cannot protect. The following morning, I instructed our executive assistant to announce internally that Ethan Bennett would assume the role of Vice President of Strategic Development effective immediately, a title that sounded powerful enough to satisfy pride yet structured in a way that required oversight from me on every meaningful decision. And I made the announcement publicly across all 10 of our restaurants to ensure that Gregory Shaw would hear of it within hours. Ethan arrived at my downtown office later that afternoon wearing a confidence that bordered on triumph, and although he attempted to mask it with formal gratitude, I saw in his posture the unmistakable relief of a man who believed his path had cleared without resistance. He thanked me with a tone that was almost performative, promising to modernize operations, expand digital presence, and negotiate stronger supplier contracts. And as he spoke, I studied his expressions carefully, searching for any trace of guilt or hesitation. Yet what I found instead was momentum, as though he had already convinced himself that events were unfolding according to plan. I responded with measured calm, reminding him that leadership would require full transparency, detailed reporting, and immediate collaboration with financial oversight, conditions he agreed to without objection, perhaps assuming that temporary scrutiny was a minor obstacle before eventual dominance. Over the next 2 weeks, I observed him closely without appearing intrusive, allowing him to schedule vendor meetings, review property leases, and initiate conversations about restructuring underperforming locations. And although his proposals were framed as innovation, they subtly aligned with vulnerabilities that Gregory Shaw had previously attempted to exploit during acquisition offers. Thomas Calloway kept me informed through discreet updates, reporting that individuals linked to Shaw's operations had been spotted near 2 of our suburban locations under the pretense of private dining reservations. And while no overt threats were made, their presence alone signaled coordination rather than coincidence. Simultaneously, I authorized a forensic audit of internal communications under the justification of cybersecurity reinforcement. And within days, irregularities began surfacing in email exchanges between Ethan and an external consulting firm that, upon deeper investigation, was quietly financed by one of Shaw's holding companies. The pattern was subtle but undeniable, with strategic documents shared prematurely, supplier negotiation details forwarded before finalization, and financial forecasts accessed outside normal authorization hours, suggesting that my son was not merely influenced but actively cooperating. One evening, as I reviewed these findings, alone in my study, I felt the familiar weight of Margaret's absence more sharply than usual. Because betrayal from a competitor could be confronted with litigation or market dominance, yet betrayal from a son required emotional discipline that no corporate training could provide. Despite the evidence mounting in front of me, I chose not to confront Ethan directly, understanding that premature exposure would drive him deeper into Shaw's protection, and instead I initiated the second phase of my response by restructuring the ownership framework of Bennett Hospitality Group through a quiet transfer of controlling shares into a family trust protected by conditional clauses that removed automatic succession rights in the event of criminal or unethical conduct. The legal filings were executed within 72 hours under confidentiality agreements that prevented disclosure until activation, and although Ethan remained unaware of this shift, the foundation of his anticipated inheritance had already begun dissolving beneath his feet. Meanwhile, Gregory Shaw made his move publicly by announcing plans to expand aggressively into territories adjacent to 3 of my flagship restaurants, framing it as healthy competition, while privately signaling through intermediaries that acquisition discussions could be reopened should I choose to retire gracefully. I declined his indirect invitation through silence, which in business often communicates more powerfully than response, and instead authorized renovations at 2 key locations. Investments that appeared bold but were strategically timed to increase valuation and reduce vulnerability to forced sale narratives. Ethan responded to these renovations with unusual irritation, arguing that capital should be preserved rather than invested, and his tone carried a sharpness that revealed misalignment between his private expectations and my public strategy, which confirmed that Shaw's timeline did not account for resistance. Thomas later informed me that one of the same men seen in the parking structure weeks earlier had approached a mid-level kitchen manager at one of our suburban properties, subtly inquiring about staff loyalty and internal dissatisfaction, and though no explicit threats were made, the pattern resembled groundwork for destabilization rather than partnership. At that moment, the scope of the plan became clear to me in full. The attempted poisoning had not been solely about inheritance. It had been about speed. If I had died suddenly, uncertainty would have fractured leadership. Internal panic would have weakened morale, and Shaw could have positioned himself as rescuer while Ethan stepped into authority under guidance, claiming continuity rather than takeover. Instead, I was alive, observant, and allowing them to believe that their infiltration remained undetected. 3 weeks after Ethan's promotion, I scheduled a formal board gathering at our original Chicago location, presenting it as a strategic review meeting to evaluate expansion and modernization initiatives, and I requested that Gregory Shaw attend as a special industry guest under the pretense of exploring collaborative opportunities, a move that surprised even Thomas. When I informed him of it, Shaw accepted the invitation within hours, and Ethan reacted with visible tension, masked as enthusiasm, perhaps interpreting the meeting as validation of his progress rather than the stage. I was quietly constructing. In preparation for that gathering, I compiled surveillance footage, financial audit trails, email exchanges, and legal documentation into a secure digital archive, accessible only through my authorization, ensuring that once revealed, the evidence would dismantle not only the attempted takeover but also any illusion of misunderstanding. The night before the board meeting, I stood alone in my office overlooking the river, reflecting on the journey from a single diner to 10 thriving establishments, and I understood that the most difficult negotiations of my life were not fought in conference rooms but across dinner tables where trust was assumed rather than verified. Ethan believed he was approaching power. Gregory Shaw believed he was orchestrating transition. Both men were moving closer to what they thought was control. Neither realized that the structure beneath them had already shifted, and the next evening would determine whether my son understood the difference between ambition and consequence. The next evening did not begin as a confrontation, but as a performance, carefully staged beneath polished chandeliers and quiet confidence, because the most decisive battles are not fought with raised voices but with prepared evidence and controlled silence. The boardroom at our original Chicago flagship restaurant had been reserved after closing hours, its long walnut table illuminated softly, its walls lined with framed photographs documenting the evolution of Bennett Hospitality Group from a single neighborhood diner to 10 fully operating restaurants across 3 states. And as I took my seat at the head of that table, I felt neither anger nor hesitation, only a clarity that arrives when emotion is forced to surrender to responsibility. Thomas Calloway sat to my right, composed and attentive, carrying a secured tablet that contained copies of every financial irregularity. We had uncovered, and to my left sat our two independent board members, individuals whose loyalty was to governance rather than sentiment, because I had intentionally ensured that tonight would not revolve around personal accusations but around documented fact. Ethan entered moments later with the restrained confidence of someone expecting validation, and behind him walked Gregory Shaw, whose tailored suit and controlled smile projected the calm of a man who believed he had navigated countless negotiations successfully, unaware that tonight he was not attending a discussion but a reckoning. I opened the meeting by thanking everyone for attending and acknowledging Ethan's recent appointment as Vice President of Strategic Development, praising his initiative publicly, in a tone that disarmed suspicion, because sometimes reinforcement lowers defenses more effectively than confrontation. Gregory spoke next, presenting a polished proposal outlining potential strategic alignment between his restaurant holdings and ours, emphasizing shared resources, streamlined supply chains, and eventual equity integration under joint leadership. Language that sounded collaborative, yet clearly positioned him at the center of operational control. As he spoke, I watched Ethan carefully, noticing how subtly his posture leaned toward Shaw rather than toward me, and in that single detail I saw confirmation. That alliance had already been internalized. When Gregory finished, I allowed a brief silence to settle over the room before responding, not with rejection but with appreciation for his proposal, stating that before any integration discussions could proceed, transparency required review of certain recent findings that impacted governance and succession planning. Thomas then connected the secured display to the boardroom screen, and the first image that appeared was surveillance footage from the parking structure 3 weeks earlier, clearly showing Ethan meeting with two men previously identified through Thomas's contacts as affiliates connected to Shaw's operational network. The room shifted instantly, and although no one spoke, the visual evidence replaced assumption with fact. Gregory attempted to maintain composure, suggesting coincidence, perhaps a misunderstanding, yet before his explanation could gain momentum, the screen transitioned to a series of documented email exchanges between Ethan and the consulting firm quietly, financed by one of Shaw's subsidiaries, detailing premature disclosures of supplier negotiations and financial forecasts that violated internal confidentiality agreements. Ethan's face changed in that moment, not into remorse but into calculation, as though he was searching for an alternative narrative that might soften the impact. Yet evidence leaves little space for reinterpretation when presented methodically. I then addressed the most serious element, not through accusation but through chronology, explaining that on the evening of our family dinner 3 weeks earlier, a security officer had reported Ethan's meeting with individuals associated with Shaw prior to that gathering, and that following that dinner, a laboratory analysis had confirmed the presence of a toxic substance introduced into my beverage, a substance capable of inducing cardiac distress in someone of my age. The silence that followed carried weight beyond business, because now the room understood that this was not solely a corporate maneuver but a deliberate endangerment of life. Ethan attempted to interrupt, claiming that he had no knowledge of any poisoning attempt, that his interactions with Shaw were purely strategic. That ambition had been misinterpreted as betrayal, yet his voice lacked conviction, and Gregory's composure began to fracture under the realization that legal exposure extended beyond competitive ethics into criminal liability. At that point, I revealed the final measure that neither of them anticipated. 72 hours after the poisoning incident, controlling shares of Bennett Hospitality Group had been transferred into an irrevocable trust, protected by clauses that automatically nullified succession rights for any beneficiary involved in fraudulent, unethical, or criminal conduct against the company or its leadership. And the activation of those clauses had been authorized that morning based on documented evidence. Ethan no longer possessed automatic inheritance rights. His position as vice president was formally suspended pending legal review, and any further claim to executive authority required unanimous board approval, which, in light of the evidence, was not forthcoming. Gregory attempted to distance himself immediately, suggesting that independent consultants may have acted without his authorization, yet financial tracing demonstrated direct funding pathways from his holding company to the consulting firm, engaged by Ethan, leaving plausible deniability fragile at best. I concluded the meeting not with anger, but with resolution, informing Gregory that all materials would be forwarded to federal authorities for investigation regarding attempted corporate sabotage and endangerment, and that any further contact with our properties would be treated as hostile interference subject to civil and criminal action. He left without offering another word, his earlier confidence replaced by controlled retreat. Because power shifts silently before it becomes visible, Ethan remained seated long after. The others stood, his expression no longer defiant but hollow, as though the structure he had believed solid beneath him had vanished unexpectedly. He asked me then, not as a strategist but as a son, why I had not simply confronted him privately. I told him that trust had already been confronted weeks earlier, when I chose to believe he valued integrity over inheritance, and that the difference between a mistake and betrayal lies in intention, because ambition seeks growth while betrayal seeks replacement. Legal proceedings unfolded over the following months, and while Gregory Shaw managed to negotiate settlements that protected portions of his business empire, his expansion into our territories stalled under scrutiny, and his reputation within the industry absorbed damage that no press release could fully repair. Ethan faced consequences more personal than financial, as the board voted unanimously to remove him from any leadership pathway within the company until such time as he could demonstrate ethical rehabilitation, a path that required years rather than entitlement. Bennett Hospitality Group did not collapse, as they anticipated. Instead, revenue strengthened after strategic reinvestment. Employee loyalty deepened once transparency replaced rumor, and our 10 restaurants continued, operating under stable leadership that valued governance over greed. I remained at the helm not out of stubbornness, but out of responsibility, because leadership at 65 is not about control, but about stewardship. And I understood now more clearly than ever that succession is not a right granted by blood, but a privilege earned by character. There are nights when I still replay that dinner in my mind, when I remember the quiet whisper from a security officer who chose integrity over indifference, and I recognize that survival was not merely physical but structural, because that whisper did not only save my life, it exposed the fragility of assumed loyalty. If you build something over decades, if you sacrifice comfort for vision, if you trust family with access to your legacy, you must also accept that protection of that legacy requires courage. When betrayal reveals itself wearing a familiar face, I did not destroy my son. His choices dismantled his inheritance. And in the end, the greatest lesson I learned was that power inherited without integrity collapses under scrutiny, while power defended with patience endures beyond conspiracy. Tell me something. If the person you trusted most stood closest to your success, would you see the danger before it was too late? Or would you wait for a whisper to save you?